And welcome, Patricia.
Thank you very much.
It's such an honor for us to have you join us. And congratulations on your new appointment as Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC. You've already heard all of the cliches about the big shoes you have to fill. I don't know what the appropriate phrase is in Espanol, but I'm a big fan of Christiana Figueres, and everybody that I know in the climate movement was so happy when you were selected. Everyone remembers what an outstanding job you did in managing the Conference of the Parties in Cancun in your native Mexico. So what's it like assuming these new responsibilities based in Bonn?
Well, thank you. This is a very generous introduction. Thank you very much for that. Yes, indeed. I am also a very big fan of Christiana. I think she did a wonderful job. She actually came into the Secretariat exactly in 2010 when we held the Cancun conference. So we've been friends since then, and I really admire her. And now I'm benefiting from an institution that she left behind in really an amazing shape. It's an amazing group of people. And having been a Mexican diplomat for over 35 years, I see this as a great opportunity to take up such a big challenge where I hope I can put to the service of humanity, of the United Nations, all the experience and the skills that I acquired over those long years in diplomatic career.
Well, your skill and experience have already shown through, and I don't want to over-compliment you or lay it on thick, but everyone has complete and total confidence in your stewardship of this important mission. And Christiana told me early on of her extremely high regard for you. I've seen you in action. And what do you think are the most pressing challenges? I know you have a full plate, but if you had to single out 2 or 3 of the most pressing challenges right now, what would you list?
Well, of course, I think the implementation of the commitments under the Paris Agreement is one very clear priority. And it's a priority that presents challenges in many ways. For the UN Secretariat, it represents turning from method of work that was very much concentrated in negotiations into a mode where our task should be to support countries in really putting in place policies and actions that will allow them to comply their commitments under the Paris Agreement. For the countries themselves, it also means building up, in many cases, building up national legislation, legal frameworks, institutional frameworks, developing new methods of work in order to really get the projects on the ground. But besides getting that kind of action, also getting the framework that will allow those actions to be sustainable, that it is not only 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 projects, but really that they are then prepared to go into a development path that is sustainable, that will support this transition towards a low-carbon economy.
Well, that's well said. And of course, this year marks the 20th anniversary of Bonn becoming the UN Center for Sustainable Development. And I know you have said that in combating the climate crisis and solving the climate crisis, we all need to put some of that energy toward sustainable development efforts. And of course, that has been part of the central mission in solving the climate crisis from the very beginning, because developing and developed nations, emerging economies, all of these different countries that are often in very different stages of development, it's absolutely central for success to pay close attention to sustainable development along with the solving of the climate crisis.
Absolutely. First, on this relationship between development and combating climate change. I think it's very important to realize that on the ground, we only have one development agenda, and that really counts for developing countries and for developed countries as well. I had the privilege of being part of the high-level panel that the Secretary General put together in order to prepare the post-2015 report for that at the end translated into the 2030 development agenda. So I was deeply involved in that, and we did realize that climate change, fight against climate change, is really an issue that cuts across all sectors. We have 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and we can take each one of them, and all of them relate in different ways to fighting climate change. At that time, we did incorporate Goal 13 on climate change because we wanted to give it visibility. And I think it was the correct decision. But we do need to realize that addressing climate change is not only an environmental issue, that it is really an issue that is in the core of sustainable development. If we want to make the transformation that we need in order to achieve the goals that were set in the Paris Agreement, we do need to incorporate these objectives and these goals into the national development programs, into national policies, and generate the structures that are absolutely needed for that.
Absolutely. You say it very well. And of course, those who dig deeply into the climate crisis quickly realize that if we were not to solve it, sustainable development would quickly become impossible. And the other side of the coin is that the jobs-intensive nature of this transition to renewable energy and efficiency and retrofitting of buildings and sustainable agriculture and forestry is actually the best source of new good employment opportunities in the world, which is one of the central pillars of development. But I wanted to ask you about two of the details of the Paris Agreement that I personally feel are especially important. And they are two of the binding provisions in the Paris Agreement. One is information transparency, and the other is the mandatory 5-year review process, which some have begun to refer to as a review and ratchet process. And the reason they use that phrase, of course, is that we have this historic, wonderful development that the cost of solar electricity and wind electricity and battery storage and efficiency improvements, all of those costs happily continue to come down so dramatically. It's really heaven sent, one could say. And so during this review process, I think that with the transparent information, publics will be able to see, hopefully, that the ambition that nations bring to the review process and the potential increase of their ambition is going to be actually much easier than many thought when the Paris Agreement was signed even. Because just in the last year, the best solar electric plants have now come down to a cost that's 1/2 of the cost of electricity from coal. Not in every region, of course, but it's moving inexorably in that direction.
Yes.
So I'm sorry for the complexity of this question, but here is the dynamic that I see. You know, the Climate Reality Project works on raising public awareness and mobilizing publics to support the action that all of these governments are pledging to take. How can the transparent information be made available in a form that is easily accessible to and understandable by activists, NGOs, civil society, and publics generally, so that they can effectively communicate with their own national governments, hey, look, this is easier than you thought. The cost is coming down. What you've pledged in the past, we could probably do more. I don't want to cause trouble for you because governments may not appreciate you conspiring with me to get their publics to encourage them to do more. But I have a suspicion that maybe you do want that result. And I again apologize for the complexity of the question, but I'm sure you understand it. So what would you say in response?
Well, I would say on the side of communication, there is no doubt that we do have a challenge, and especially within the UN and within the UN negotiating process, people get used to refer to the different aspects of the negotiations in very technical terms that are not understandable for the people outside, for the regular citizen that feels the effects of climate change but does not really have the knowledge about the phenomenon. So we do have a challenge, and this is a point that I have been sharing, I would say, with really very positive responses in terms of the need really to dedicate resources, human and all kinds of resources for communication. And of course, your work is absolutely crucial in making the public aware of what it really is about, this issue of climate change, global warming. So I fully agree with you. We really need to get the story. As a colleague of us says frequently, the head of UN Environment, he says, we have not gotten the conversation to the kitchen table, and we need to get it there.
Right. Well,
on the other hand,
go ahead.
Yeah, please.
No, you were saying on the other hand.
On the other hand, I completely agree with you that there are really very clear indications that the transition and the change can be probably easier than we had thought.
Yep.
And I do want to mention one indication of the possibilities of making that transition in a very efficient and fast way is the fact itself that the Paris Agreement entered into force less than 1 year after it was agreed, which was something nobody was expecting at the time it was signed. This means there is the possibility to get the political will, and the political will also responds to an enormous mobilization by society, by business, by the different actors that have a role to play in this process. And the fact that the Paris Agreement provides for a 5-year review exercise, I think it's very, very fortunate. But we are actually already witnessing that some countries, and not only developed countries, some developing countries like Morocco, who just hosted the conference, are revising their national programs in order to raise ambition already. And we are not even one year after the Paris Agreement. So I think there is really lots of signals to be optimistic. We have to also acknowledge that the creativity of scientists and also of NGOs has been enormous, has created opportunities that many people would have thought impossible just a few years ago. So while not ignoring the complexity and the difficulties of the challenge, I think we do have reasons to stay enthusiastic and stay optimistic.
Well, that's fantastic. And since the Paris Agreement, Mother Nature has been even more insistent that we recognize what the stakes are. In the meeting in Morocco and in the C40 cities meeting in Mexico City, it was obvious to everyone that the signal that the world intended to send in the Paris Agreement has been received. Business, industry, civil society, regional governments, local governments, many national governments have gotten that signal. The world is moving. And in closing, I want to thank you for your leadership and pledge to you, having talked to our climate leaders in countries all around the world, I know they are eagerly anticipating the opportunity to work with the team that you are leading at UNFCCC in order to get the 5-year review process to be a tremendous success and lift the ambitions of countries around the world. So congratulations and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, and I look forward to continue being in very close contact and to together get the best we can out of the wonderful opportunities.
Gracias.